So what if Albert Einstein's general relativity, which is, arguably the most celebrated and elegantly mathematical theory of the 20th century, is actually just a beautiful mistake?
Yeah, I mean, it is a incredibly profound premise to even bring up because general relativity has survived literally every single experimental test we've ever thrown at it for over a century now.
Right, exactly.
So, to suggest it's flawed, well, that requires an entirely new framework for how we interpret those exact same
And
experiments.
that is exactly what we are investigating today. So welcome to this deep dive, where our mission is to really dig into this fascinating source material.
It's some dense material, too.
Oh, absolutely. We're looking at a series of detailed white papers, some course notes, and these really foundational theoretical essays authored by Sandeep J. Chavan.
Right. And for those who don't know, Siobhan is an independent researcher. He's an educator who actually spent decades teaching physics and chemistry at the Gyrus Institute.
Yeah, and in these texts, he proposes what he calls the reference spine of basically a completely new era of physics.
Mm.
And I want to clarify right away for you listening, he doesn't argue that Einstein's math was wrong.
No, not all.
Instead, he argues that Einstein perfectly mapped a shadow play. Like, general relativity accurately measured the effects we see in the cosmos, but it just completely misidentified the underlying physical cause.
Which is, a crucial distinction to make. Siobhan approaches this with a lot of deep respect for Einstein.
Definitely.
He fully acknowledges that the math of general relativity works flawlessly. I mean, for predicting orbital precessions, gravitational lensing, and even the precise timing adjustments we need for our GPS satellites.
Right. The stuff we use every day.
Exactly. The issue Siobhan raises isn't computational at all. It is ontological. Basically, general relativity mistook the map for the territory.
It described the geometry of the shadows on the wall with breathtaking accuracy, right? But it never accounted for the fire casting them.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it.
Well, before we get into the exact mechanics of that fire, we actually need a really quick phonetic rule check for you guys listening. We are analyzing a framework Siobhan calls UED, which stands for Universal Energy Dynamics.
Right.
And to capture the precise definitions he uses in his papers, we will be pronouncing the acronyms exactly as individual letters throughout this discussion. So you'll hear us refer to UED, as well as SVE, SVE, and ATT.
Yeah, and those aren't just arbitrary labels, They represent highly specific mechanical states in his physics model.
Gotcha.
So if we are going to evaluate Siobhan's claim that Einstein mapped a shadow play, we really have to start by examining the fundamental substrate of the universe.
The actual floor beneath the stage.
Exactly, because in standard general relativity, space is treated as a pliable geometric fabric. It bends and it warps depending on the distribution of mass and energy. The metric tensor basically dictates all that curvature.
Right. Einstein gave us that whole Riemannian geometry thing, the classic idea that mass tells space-time how to curve and space-time tells mass how to move.
Yep, exactly.
But reading through Siobhan's critiques, he really zeroes in on this glaring omission in that mathematical elegance, because Einstein never actually provided a physical mechanism for the curvature.
No, he didn't.
We have this geometric coordinate system that curves, but absolutely no physical substance that is actually doing the curving.
Yeah, he essentially gave us the mathematics of deformation, but without a deformable material.
Which is kind of crazy when you think about it.
It is. But physics just accepted this because, well, the predictive power was so incredibly strong. We became so satisfied with calculating the curvature that we collectively agreed to just ignore the lack of a physical medium.
Out of sight, out of mind, right?
Exactly. But in UED, Chavan introduces the actual floor beneath this mathematical stage. He defines it as SVE, which stands for structured vacuum energy.
And I really want to be precise about what SVE is, because the moment we talk about a medium or a vacuum, physicists listening will immediately think of, the disproven 19th century luminiferous ether.
Oh, for sure. Or they'll think of the modern quantum field theory model.
Right, the boiling vacuum filled with virtual particle pairs popping in and out.
Yeah.
But SVE is fundamentally different from both of those models, isn't it?
Highly different. I mean, the classical ether was conceived as this fluid or like a rigid structural wind that planets physically plowed through.
Which the Michelson-Morley experiment ruled out entirely.
Right, exactly. And then the quantum foam is this chaotic statistical manifestation of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. But SVE SVE, by contrast, is a highly structured, tension-ready field of energy in perfect equilibrium.
So it's not boiling or bubbling.
Not at all. It is not a fluid. It is an absolute motionless architecture. It literally holds the potential for all mass, charge, and force, but it remains perfectly stable unless it's provoked by some localized disturbance.
Okay, well, if SVE is an absolute motionless architecture, that brings us to what I think is the most radical mechanical claim in Chavan's entire framework.
Yeah, get ready for this one.
He asserts that the universe itself is absolutely still, like nothing actually moves.
Yeah, it completely forces a rewiring of how we understand momentum and inertia.
I'll say it.
In UED, reality is not constructed of discrete objects traveling across an empty void. Reality is constructed of continuous ripple alignments within the SVE.
Okay, let me challenge the mechanics of this because I know you listening are probably thinking the same thing.
Go for it.
If I look at a planetary orbit or, a particle accelerator where we are slamming protons together at near light speed, we are measuring actual kinetic energy. We are measuring physical displacement over time.
Right.
So if the universe is perfectly still, how does UED account for the undeniable, measurable reality of inertia and velocity?
It accounts for it through what Chavan calls an aligned consequence.
An aligned consequence.
No.
Okay. What does that mean mechanically?
Well, we have to stop thinking of a particle as a billiard ball that just rolls from point A to point B. In SVE, a particle is not a solid object. It is a localized, persistent pattern of tension.
Like a knot in the field.
Exactly, like a topological defect or a stress knot. So when that particle appears to move, what is actually happening is that the nodes of the SVE network are sequentially transferring that tension state.
Oh, I see. So the field itself doesn't translate spatially. The structural tension is merely resolving itself linearly.
Yes.
It makes me think of like a digital cellular automaton or just the pixels on a screen. The pixels don't physically slide across your monitor, right?
Right. That's a brilliant analogy.
They simply update their states based on the rules of their neighbors, creating the perfect manifestation of a moving shape.
That is exactly how you should visualize it. The medium remains totally stationary. What we call motion is merely the continuous propagation of a tension pattern attempting to resolve itself.
Okay, so then what is kinetic energy in this model?
The kinetic energy we measure is just the structural cost of the SVE, constantly readjusting its equilibrium to accommodate that shifting node of tension.
So the object doesn't travel at all?
Nope. The object doesn't travel. The alignment consequence propagates.
Wow. Okay, so if matter is just a persistent tension pattern, and motion is just the sequential updating of that pattern across the SVE nodes, then how does this framework address gravitation?
Yeah, that's the next big hurdle.
Because Einstein's answer to gravity was that these moving objects follow the straightest possible path through a curved geometry. If geometry isn't curving, what is dictating the orbital path of a planet or, an apple falling from a tree?
Right. In general relativity, the curvature of the metric tensor dictates those geodesics. But Chavan points out that saying mass causes geometry to curve is just a mathematical description. It's not a causal mechanism.
It's the map, not the territory again.
Exactly. So in UED, Chavan reframes gravity completely. He says it's not a geometric curve, and it's certainly not an attractive pulling force. It's a ripple gradient.
A ripple gradient. Let's break down the mechanics of that, because the classic analogy we always hear is the heavy bowling ball on a rubber sheet, right? It warps the space to pull smaller objects in.
Right, the trampoline analogy.
Yeah. But if a massive object, like a star, isn't bending a fabric, what is it physically doing to the SVE?
Well, Chavan defines mass as a highly dense condensation of ripple tension.
Okay.
So a star is essentially a region where the SVE field is incredibly strained. And this dense knot of tension cannot just exist in isolation, right? It stresses the surrounding structure of the vacuum.
So it bleeds outward.
Exactly. It creates an asymmetrical gradient of equilibrium. The tension is highest right at the center of the mass, and it gradually dissipates outward into the surrounding SVE. So
any smaller tension pattern, say a comet or just a tiny satellite, that enters this gradient is going to interact with that asymmetrical stress.
Spot on. And because the fundamental tendency of the SVE is to seek absolute equilibrium, Any localized pattern within it will naturally migrate toward the state that resolves the system's overall tension.
No, interesting. So it's not being dragged by anything.
Right. Chavan actually compares it to water naturally flowing downhill.
Okay, yeah. Water flowing downhill.
Yeah.
That makes sense. The water isn't being pulled by some invisible, mysterious force from the bottom of the mountain.
No, it is simply behaving according to the path of least resistance within a physical terrain.
It's basically a physical manifestation of the principle of least action. The smaller object in free fall is passively responding to the ripple terrain of the SVE, just seeking a state that minimizes the structural strain on the field.
Exactly. And the beauty of this is that it completely removes the need for theoretical force carriers.
Like gravitons.
Yes. We don't need hypothetical graviton particles exchanging invisible messages across millions of miles to tell planets how to orbit.
Which is huge because we've never actually found a graviton, right?
Exactly. Gravitons have never been observed precisely because, under UED, they are mathematically unnecessary artifacts. Gravity completely ceases to be a fundamental interaction or a distinct force.
It just becomes entirely emergent.
Right. It is simply the continuous adjustment of the field's tension network. When you are in free fall, you feel weightless, not because gravity has magically stopped acting upon you, but because you are no longer resisting the field's gradient.
You are perfectly aligning with the SVE, tension resolution process.
Precisely.
I mean, this resolves a massive conceptual headache in standard model physics.
Yeah.
We've spent decades, literally decades, trying to unify gravity with quantum mechanics and failing largely because gravity just refuses to behave like the other localized quantum forces.
It's the stubborn outlier.
Yeah. But Chavan's SVE suggests we've just been trying to quantize a shadow. If gravity is just a structural macro gradient of the vacuum-seeking equilibrium, well, of course it shouldn't have a quantum particle.
It's such a profound simplification. By replacing empty coordinate geometry with a structured, tension-bearing field, the causal mechanics of gravity just become so deeply intuitive.
They really do. But, the implications of a stationary SV field become even more disruptive when we apply them to electromagnetism.
Oh, absolutely. This is where it gets really wild.
Right, because if the universe is perfectly still and motion is merely the propagation of tension patterns, we have to address the ultimate standard of motion in all of physics, which is, of course, the photon.
The speed of light.
Exactly. Which brings us to scientific act 3, the light revolution. In standard model physics, light possesses a wave-particle duality. It is a discrete photon that physically travels through the vacuum at, exactly 299,792,458 meters per second.
Right, the universal speed limit.
But Chavan asserts that light does not travel at all.
Yeah. In UED, the concept of a photon physically traversing an empty void is just completely discarded.
Wow. Then what is it?
Light is redefined as a handshake between fields.
A handshake.
Yeah. It is a localized moment of field permission. It's a direct resolution of tension between an emitting source and an absorbing observer.
Okay, let's deeply scrutinize the physics of this handshake. Because when a hydrogen atom transitions from a higher energy state to a lower one, standard physics says it emits a photon to carry away that difference in energy.
Right.
So how does Chavan describe this exact event mechanically within the SVE?
Okay, so when that atom drops to a lower energy state, it fundamentally alters its tension footprint within the SVE.
It changes shape, basically.
Sort of. It has a sudden imbalance, what we'd call a delta, that must be resolved to return to local equilibrium. So that localized shift in tension vibrates the immediate nodes of the structured vacuum.
Okay.
However, in UED, that energy does not detach and fly away as an independent bullet or particle. The tension disturbance propagates through the contiguous nodes of the SVE as a ripple.
Like dropping a stone in a pond.
Right. And when that specific resonant frequency aligns with another localized pattern, say an electron in the retina of an observer that is capable of absorbing that exact tension delta, the two regions of the field reach a resonant agreement.
The handshake.
Exactly. The emission and the absorption are not isolated events separated by a traveling projectile in the void. They are the two endpoints of a continuous structural realignment within the SVE.
That is mind-bending. The field literally negotiates the transfer of tension. And that successful resonance, the alignment of that ripple, is the phenomenon we perceive as light.
Precisely.
But wait, if light isn't a projectile traveling through space, what is C? I mean, we measure the speed of light with extreme precision.
And we do.
We literally bounce lasers off retroreflectors on the moon and time the delay. If the photon isn't flying through the void, What exactly is moving at roughly 300 million meters per second?
Well, under Chavan's model, we aren't measuring the speed of a projectile at all. We are measuring the latency of the SVE.
The latency.
Yeah. Chavan redefines c not as a speed limit for moving objects, but as the universe's resolution speed ceiling.
Resolution speed ceiling.
Right. It is the absolute maximum rate at which the structured vacuum can actually update its nodal tension states.
Oh, I see. It's like the sheer modulus of the vacuum structure.
Yeah.
Like just as sound travels through steel faster than it travels through air because the atomic lattice of steel is denser and stiffer.
That's a great comparison.
So C is just the physical limit of how fast the fundamental architecture of SVE can process a state change.
That is the exact mechanical reality here. When we calculate that light takes 8 minutes to reach Earth from the sun, we are not tracking a photon on an 8-minute journey through emptiness.
Right.
We are observing that it takes the SVE lattice exactly 8 minutes of sequential node-to-node negotiation to resolve the tension imbalance created by the sun's fusion reaction with the structure of the Earth.
That is a staggering paradigm shift. But I have a follow-up question. Why is there a ceiling at all?
What do you mean?
Well, in classical Newtonian physics, gravitational effects were just assumed to be instantaneous. Why does the UED framework necessitate a finite processing speed for this tension resolution? Like, why can't the vacuum just update instantly?
Because an instantaneous resolution would fundamentally violate the thermodynamic architecture of the field. Chavan explains that the universe enforces the C ceiling to prevent what he calls cost-free delta erasure.
Cost-free delta erasure. Let's really dig into the physics of that phrase because it sounds important. So a delta is a change in state, right? An imbalance or a gradient.
Correct. The universe essentially operates as a strictly balanced thermodynamic and structural ledger.
An accounting book.
Yeah. Any imbalance in one region must be paid for and sequentially resolved by the adjacent regions. If C were infinite, if tension could be resolved instantaneously across any distance, it would mean that a massive localized delta could be erased without interacting with the intervening medium.
Oh, it would bypass the structural cause completely. Yes. It would be the equivalent of like teleporting energy from one side of the universe to the other without the connecting space experiencing any of the stress of that transfer.
Right, which breaks the rules of thermodynamics. So the SVE prevents this by mandating that every single node in the path of the resolution must temporarily bear and then pass on the tension.
So the resolution speed ceiling, C, is simply the clock speed of reality's accounting mechanism.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it. It ensures that the structural integrity of the field is maintained. Absolutely no energy is transferred without the medium experiencing the exact sequential cost of that transfer.
Wow. Well, if C is merely the processing clock speed of the SVE, that fundamentally alters how we have to approach the concept of time itself.
It shatters it, really.
Because in Minkowski spacetime and general relativity, time is a literal dimension. It is woven into space to form a 4D manifold. It flows, it bends, it stretches.
Right.
But if the SVE is just a rigid tension network sequentially updating its state, where does time exist within this architecture?
The short answer is it doesn't. Not as a fundamental dimension, anyway.
Okay, explain that.
In UED, the concept of time as a tangible, woven fabric is just completely dismantled. Time did not, quote-unquote, begin at a Big Bang, and it does not flow toward the future.
So it's an illusion.
Time is not an inherent property of the SVE. It is an emergent perception.
And this brings us to Chavan's concept of ATT.
Yeah.
ATT, which stands for Alignment Threshold Time.
Yes. In Chavan's framework, time is strictly defined as the scorecard of delay.
The scorecard of delay.
Yeah. Because the SVE is bound by the C resolution limit to prevent that cost-free delta erasure we just talked about, there is an inescapable latency between a tension disturbance occurring and the surrounding field fully resolving it.
And that delay is what we experience.
Exactly. ATT is the measurement of that exact latency. You and I, we experience time solely because the physical substrate of reality takes a non-zero amount of processing power to update its equilibrium.
So duration is really just the subjective experience of the universe doing its paperwork.
That's right.
But let's subject this to the hardest test in relativistic physics, which is time dilation. Because we have empirical proof that time is relative.
We definitely do.
Like the famous Hafeel-Keating experiment, they flew actual atomic clocks around the world on commercial airliners. And when they landed, those clocks had recorded less time than the clocks they left on the ground.
Right, a classic experiment.
Or look at GPS satellites. They experience less gravitational pull but higher velocity than receivers on Earth, which requires constant microsecond adjustments to keep their clocks synchronized.
Otherwise, GPS would fail in a matter of minutes.
Exactly. So if time isn't a geometric dimension that literally stretches under high velocity or strong gravity, how does UED explain time dilation?
It explains it mechanically through what Chavan calls field straining.
Field straining.
Yeah. We have to look at the mechanical state of the SVE nodes in those exact extreme environments. When an atomic clock is placed in orbit or, accelerated to immense velocities, it is moving through a region of the field that is under intense structural load.
Nodes are saturated with tension.
Exactly. Think about the atomic clock itself. Its atoms, its electrons, the radioactive decay it uses to measure a tickle. All of that is entirely composed of tension patterns within the SVE.
Right, because everything is just tension in this model.
Exactly. So when the surrounding field is highly strained by the intense macro gradient of a planet's mass or by the severe kinetic updating required for high velocity, the local nodes of the vacuum are overwhelmingly preoccupied with processing that massive macro tension.
Oh, I see. They literally have less available bandwidth to process the microtension.
You've got it.
The internal mechanics of the atomic clock require the SVE nodes to update the state of the atom so a tick can even occur. But if the lattice is bogged down processing the intense gravitational gradient, the propagation of the clock's internal alignment is physically impeded.
The structural cost is just higher, so the entire process takes longer. The clock doesn't tick slower because a mystical fourth dimension called time has stretched out and lengthened the duration of a second.
It ticks slower because the physical medium that facilitates its internal functions is operating under extreme resistance.
Exactly. Time dilation just becomes a simple matter of field efficiency.
It's a kinematic degradation, not a geometric paradox.
Yeah.
This strips away all the paradoxical baggage of standard relativity.
It really does.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about twin paradoxes or that whole block universe determinism where the past, present, and future all somehow exist simultaneously.
Right. Under UED, there is only the absolute present state of the SVE field constantly updating itself. The past is just a previous configuration of tension, and the future is the pending alignment.
It completely restores absolute causality to physics. There is only the immediate mechanical negotiation of equilibrium within the SVE.
That is just so clean.
Yeah.
But this level of mechanical determinism, this realization that everything from the orbit of a galaxy to the firing of a neuron in my brain is just the structured vacuum-seeking tension equilibrium, it really demands that we examine the philosophical layer of Chavan's work.
Oh, definitely. And he doesn't shy away from that. His papers dedicate roughly 20% of their volume to the epistemological consequences of SVE.
Because if everything is an aligned consequence, it profoundly changes what it actually means to be an observer in the universe.
It dismantles the entire myth of the detached scientist. I mean, in classical physics and even in a lot of interpretations of quantum mechanics, we operate under this assumption that the observer stands outside the system, just passively recording data.
Right, the objective bystander.
Exactly. But Chavan proposes what he terms scientific method 2.0. In UED, the observer is not external at all. The observer is a highly complex, dense cluster of SVE tension patterns.
But the act of observation is literally an act of co-participation with the field.
Yes.
When a scientist looks through a telescope at a distant galaxy, the scientist's own structural field, like their retina, their optic nerves, their consciousness, must literally shake hands with the incoming ripple gradient.
Precisely. You cannot measure a phenomenon in the SVE without your own localized tension field aligning with it.
That's wild.
The observer's own ATT threshold completely dictates the parameters of what is perceived. Perception isn't the recording of a separate reality. Perception is the final ripple in the chain of structural consequence. The alignment is the reality.
Which really echoes the spirit of why Chavan embarked on this work in the first place, I think. This entire paradigm isn't a malicious attack on Einstein's legacy.
Not at all.
It is an attempt to complete it. Einstein pushed the geometry of spacetime to its absolute mathematical limit, but he left the causal mechanism blank.
And Chavan honors that rigorous, rebellious spirit of Einstein by possessing the courage to look at a century of established consensus and ask the impossible question.
He looked at the perfect mathematical stage Einstein built and demanded to know what the floor was made of.
And by identifying SVE, he essentially offers physics a way out of the century-long deadlock between relativity and quantum mechanics. He provides a universe that is strictly logical, absolutely causal, and structurally cohesive.
Well, we've covered a massive theoretical shift today. For those of you listening, we replaced the empty bending geometry of spacetime with SVE, which is a perfectly still, highly structured vacuum field where nothing actually travels, and matter is merely an aligned consequence of tension.
A huge leap.
We redefined gravity not as a warping of dimensions, but as a dense condensation of ripple tension that creates a gradient of equilibrium. It forces objects into freefall simply to find the path of least resistance.
Right, water flowing downhill.
And we fundamentally changed the mechanics of light, viewing photons not as traveling projectiles, but as a resonance handshake between fields.
Constrained by C.
Constrained by C, exactly. The universe's physical limit on how fast it can resolve tension to prevent cost-free delta erasure.
Which is such a brilliant accounting mechanism.
And finally, we dismantled time as a dimension, framing it instead through ATT as the pure scorecard of delay, where relativistic time dilation is just a clock's internal mechanisms struggling to process through a heavily strained field.
It really is a breathtakingly elegant architecture. It respines the very foundations of how we relate to physical reality.
If Chavan is right, our entire perception of a dynamic, moving universe is really just an illusion generated by the latency of a perfectly still structure resolving its internal stress.
Yeah. We spent a century obsessively mapping the shadows on the wall, measuring their speed and their distortion, entirely unaware that the wall itself was the actual mechanism.
We are literally just patterns of tension within that wall, witnessing our own resolution.
It's poetry, honestly.
It really is. So as you digest these mechanics, as you look at the light from a lamp in your room, or feel the gravity holding you in your chair right now, I want to leave you with one final implication to explore on your own.
Let's hear it.
If the universe is a motionless architecture, and everything from the speed of light to the flow of time only exists because your localized SVE, SSVE field, eventually shakes hands with the propagating ripple of tension, what happens to the physical state of reality the moment you stop looking for it?